and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we'll continue our reading of The Rolling Stones by Robert Heinlein. Chapter 9, Assets Recoverable. The twins kept out of their father's way for the next several days. He was unusually tender and affectionate with all of them, but he never smiled, and his mood was likely to flare suddenly and unexpectedly into anger. They stayed in their bunk room and pretended to study. They actually did study some of the time. Mead and Hazel split the care of Lowell between them. The child's feeling of security was damaged by the absence of his mother. He expressed it by temper tantrums and demands for attention. Hazel took over the cooking of lunch and dinner. She was no better at it than Mead. She could be heard twice a day burning herself and swearing and complaining that she was not the domestic type and never had had any ambitions that way. Never. Dr. Stone phoned once a day, spoke briefly with her husband, and begged off from speaking to anyone else for the reason that she was much too busy. Roger Stone's explosions of temper were most likely to occur shortly after these daily calls. Hazel alone had the courage to quiz him about the calls. On the sixth day at lunch, she said, "Well, Roger, what's the news today? Give." "Nothing much. Hazel, these chops are atrocious. They ought to be good. I flavored them with my own blood." She held out a bandaged thumb. "Why don't you try cooking? But back to the subject. Don't evade me, boy." She thinks she's on the track of something. So far as she can tell from their medical records, nobody has caught it so far who is known to have had measles. Mead said, "Measles? People don't die of that, do they?" "Hardly ever," agreed her grandmother, "though it can be fairly serious in an adult." "I didn't say it was measles," her father answered testily, "nor did your mother. She thinks it's related to measles, a mutant strain, maybe, more virulent." "Call it neo-measles," suggested Hazel. "That's a good question-begging tag, and it has an impressive scientific sound to it. Any more deaths, Roger?" "Well, yes." "How many?" She wouldn't say. "Van is still alive, though, and she says he is recovering. She told me," he added, as if trying to convince himself, "that she thought she was learning how to treat it." "Measles," Hazel said thoughtfully. "You never had it, Roger." "No, nor any of the kids." "Of course not," put in Pollux. Luna City was by long odds the healthiest place in the known universe. The routine childhood diseases of Earth had never been given a chance to establish. "How'd she sound, son?" "Dog tired." He frowned. "She even snapped at me." "Not mummy," quiet Mead, Hazel went on. "I've had measles 70 or 80 years ago. Roger, I'd better go over and help her." He smiled without humor. "She anticipated that. She said to tell you thanks, but she had all the unskilled help she could use." "Unskilled help. I like that. Why, during the epidemic of 93, there were times when I was the only woman in the colony able to change a bed. Huh." Hazel deliberately waited around the phone for the next day, determined to get a few words at least with her daughter in law. The call came in about the usual time. Roger took it. It was not his wife. "Captain Stone? Turner, sir. Charlie Turner. I'm the third engineer. Your wife asked me to phone you." "What's the matter? She busy?" "Quite busy." "Tell her to call me as soon as she's free. I'll wait by the board." "I'm afraid it's no good, sir. She was quite specific that she would not be calling you today. She won't have time." "Fiddlesticks! It'll only take her 30 seconds. In a big ship like yours, you can hook her in wherever she is." The man sounded embarrassed. "I'm sorry, sir. Dr. Stone gave strict orders not to be disturbed. But confound it, I'm very sorry, sir. Goodbye." He left him sputtering into a dead circuit. Roger Stone remained quiet for several moments, then turned a stricken face to his mother. "She's caught it." Hazel answered quietly, "Don't jump to conclusions, son." But in her own heart, she had already reached the same conclusion. Edith Stone had contracted the disease she had gone to treat. The same barren stall was given Roger Stone on the following day. By the third day, they gave up the pretense. Dr. Stone was ill, but her husband was not to worry. She had already, before she gave into it herself, progressed far enough in standardizing a treatment that all the new cases, hers among them, were doing nicely. So they said. No, they could not arrange a circuit to her bed. No, he could not talk to Captain Vandenberg. The captain was still too ill. I'm coming over, Roger Stone shouted. Turner hesitated. It's up to you, Captain, but if you do, we'll have to quarantine you here. Dr. Stone's written orders. Roger Stone switched off. He knew that that settled it. In matters medical, Edith was a Roman judge, and he could not abandon his own ship, his family, to get to Mars by themselves. One frail old woman, two cocksure half trained student pilots. No, he had to take his ship in. They sweated it out. The cooking got worse when anyone bothered to cook. It was 7 endless Earth Standard days later when the daily call was answered by Roger. Hello, darling. Edith, are you all right? Getting that way. What's your temperature? Now, darling, I won't have you quack doctoring me. My temperature is satisfactory, as is the rest of my physical being. I've lost a little weight, but I could stand to, don't you think? No, I don't. Listen, you come home, you hear me? Roger, dearest, I can't. And that's settled. This entire ship is under quarantine. But how's the rest of my family? Oh, shucks, fine, fine. We're all in the pink. Stay that way. I'll call you tomorrow. Bye, dear. Dinner that night was a celebration. Hazel cut her thumb again, but not even she cared. The daily calls, no longer a nagging worry, but a pleasure, continued. It was a week later that Dr. Stone concluded by saying, Hold on, dear. A friend of yours wants to speak with you. Okay, darling. Love and stuff. Goodbye. Roger Dodger, came a bass voice. Van, you square-headed bay window. I knew you were too mean to die. Alive and kicking, thanks to your wonderful wife, but no longer with a bay window. I haven't had time to regrow it yet. You will, no doubt. But I was asking the good doctor about something, and she couldn't give me much data. Your department. Raj, how did this speed run leave you for single H? Could you use some go juice? Captain Stone considered it. Have you any surplus, Captain? A little. Not much for this wagon, but it might be quite a lot for a kiddie cart like yours. We had to jettison, did you know? I know, and I'm sorry. I'll see that a claim is pushed through promptly. I'd advance it myself, Captain, if alimony on 3 planets left me anything to advance. Maybe it won't be necessary. He explained about the radar reflector. If we could nudge back into the old groove, we might just get together with our belongings. Vandenberg chuckled. I want to meet those kids of yours again. They appear to have grown up a bit in the last 7 years. Don't, they'll steal your bridge work. Now, about this single H, how much can you spare? Enough, I'm sure. This caper is worth trying just for the sport. I'm sure it has never been done before. Never. The two ships, perfectly matched to eye and almost so by instrument, nevertheless had drifted a couple of miles apart while the epidemic in the liner raged and died out. The undetectable gravitational attraction between them gave them mutual escape velocity much less than their tiny residual relative motion. Up to now, nothing had been done about it since they were still in the easiest of phone range. But now it was necessary to pump reactive mass from one to the other. Roger Stone threw a weight fastened to a light messenger line as straight and as far as he could heave. By the time it was slowed to a crawl by the drag of the line, the crewman from the War God came out after it on his jet suit. In due course, the messenger line brought over a heavier line, which was fastened to the smaller ship. Hand power alone took a strain on the line. While the mass of rolling stone was enormous by human muscle standards, the vector involved was too small to handle by jet, and friction was nil. In warping in a spaceship, the lack of brakes is a consideration more important than power, as numerous dents to ships and space stations testify. As a result of that gentle tug, 2.5 days later, the ships were close enough to permit a fuel hose to be connected between them. Roger and Hazel touched the hose only with wrench and spacesuit gauntlet, not enough contact to affect the quarantine even by Dr. Stone's standards. 20 minutes later, even that connection was broken, and the stone had a fresh supply of jet juice. And not too soon. Mars was a ruddy gibbous moon, bulging even bigger in the sky. It was time to prepare to maneuver. There it is. Pollux was standing watch on the radar screen. His yelp brought his grandmother floating over. More likely a flock of geese, she commented. Where? Right there, can't you see it? Hazel grudgingly conceded that the blip might be real. The next several hours were spent in measuring distance, bearing, and relative motion by radar and Doppler, and in calculating the cheapest maneuver to let them match with the errant bicycle's baggage and books. Roger Stone took it as easily as he could, being hurried somewhat by the growing nearness of Mars. He finally settled them almost dead in space relative to the floating junk pile, with a slight drift which would bring them within 300 yards of the mass, so he calculated, at closest approach a few hours hence. They spent the waiting time figuring the maneuvers to rendezvous with Mars. The Rolling Stone would not, of course, land on Mars, but at the port on Phobos. First, they must assume an almost circular ellipse around Mars, matching with Phobos. Then, as a final maneuver, they must settle the ship on the tiny moon. Simple maneuvers made fussy by one thing only. Phobos has a period of about 10 hours. The stone would have to arrive not only at the right place with the right speed and direction, but also at the right time. After the bicycles were taken aboard the ship, it would have to be nursed along while still fairly far out if she were to fall to an exact rendezvous. Everybody worked on it but Buster, Meade working under Hazel's tutelage. Pollux continued to check by radar their approach to their cargo. Roger Stone had run through and discarded two trial solutions and was roughing out another, which at last seemed to be making sense when Pollux announced that his latest angulation of the radar data showed that they were nearly as close as they would get. His father unstrapped himself and floated to a port. Where is it? Good heavens, we're practically sitting on it. Let's get busy, boys. I'm coming too, announced Hazel. Me too, agreed Lowell. Meade reached out and snagged it. That's what you think, Buster. You and Sis are going to play a wonderful game called What's for Dinner? Have fun, folks. She headed aft, towing the infant against his opposition. Outside, the bicycles looked considerably farther away. Cass glanced at the mass and said, Maybe I ought to go across on my jet suit, Dad. It would save time. I strongly doubt it. Try the heaving line, Paul. Pollux snapped the light messenger line to a pad eye. Near the weighted end had been fastened half a dozen large hooks fashioned of 6-gauge wire. His first heave seemed to be strong enough, but it missed the cluster by a considerable margin. Let me have it, Paul, Castor demanded. Let him be, ordered his father. So help me, this is the last time I'm going into space without a proper line throwing gun. Make a note of that, Cass. Put it on the shopping list when we go inside. Aye, aye, sir. The second throw was seen to hit the mass, but when Paul heaved and the line came anyway, the hooks having failed to catch. He tried again. This time the floating line came taut. Easy now, his father cautioned. We don't want a bunch of bikes in our lap. There, vast heaving. She started. They waited. Castor became impatient and suggested they give the line another tug. His father shook his head. Hazel added, I saw a green hand at the space station try to hurry a load along that way. Steel plate it was. What happened? He had started it with a pull. He thought he could stop it with a shove. They had to amputate both legs, but they saved his life. Castor shut up. A few minutes later, the disorderly mass touched down, bending a handlebar of one bike that got pinched, but with no other damage. The twins and Hazel swarmed over the mass, working free on their safety lines and clicking on with their boots only to pass bicycles into the hold, where Roger Stone stowed them according to his careful mass distribution schedule. Presently, Pollux came along Castor's not for salvage warning. Hey, Cass, here's your notice. It's no good now. Nevertheless, he accepted it and glanced at it. Then his eyes snapped wider. An endorsement had been added at the bottom. Says you, the Galactic Overlord. Captain Stone came out to investigate the delay, took the paper, and read it. He looked at his mother. Hazel? Me? Why, I've been right here in plain sight the whole time. How could I have done it? Stone crumpled the paper. I do not believe in ghosts, inside straits, or galactic overlords. If Hazel did it, no one saw her, and she never admitted it. She persisted in the theory that the galactic overlord wasn't really dead after all. To prove it, she revived him in her next episode. Chapter 10. Phobos Port. Mars has two ready-made space stations, her two tiny close-in moons, Phobos and Deimos, the dogs of the god of war, fear and panic. Deimos is a jagged, ragged mass of rock. A skipper would be hard put to find a place to put down a ship. Phobos was almost spherical and fairly smooth as we found her. Atomic power has manicured her into one big landing field all around her equator, a tidying up that may have been over hasty. By one very plausible theory, the Martian ancients used her themselves as a space station. The proof, if such there be, may lie buried under the slag of Phobos port. The Rolling Stone slid inside the orbit of Deimos, blasted as she approached the orbit of Phobos, and was matched in with Phobos, following an almost identical orbit around Mars, only a scant 5 miles from that moon. She was falling now, falling around Mars, but falling toward Phobos, for no vector had been included as yet to prevent that. The fall could not be described as a headlong plunge. At this distance, one radius of Phobos, the moon attracted the tiny mass of the spaceship with a force of less than 3/10,000ths of one Earth gravity. Captain, Spo- Captain Stone had ample time in which to calculate a vector which would let him land. It would take the better part of an hour for the stone to sink to the surface of the satellite. However, he had chosen to do it the easy way, through outside help. The jet of the Rolling Stone, capable of blasting at 6 gravities, was almost too much of a tool for the thin gravity field of a 10-mile rock, like swatting a fly with a pile driver. A few minutes after they had ceased blasting, a small scooter rocket rose from the Phobos, matched with them, and anchored up to their airlock. The spacesuited figure who swam in removed his helmet and said, "Permission to board, sir. Jason Thomas, port pilot. You asked for a pilot in tow?" "That's right, Captain Thomas. Just call me Jay. Got your mass schedule ready?" Roger Stone gave it to him. He looked it over while they looked him over. Meade thought privately that he looked more like a bookkeeper than a dashing spaceman, certainly nothing like the characters in Hazel's show. Lowell stared at him gravely and said, "Are you a Martian, mister?" The port pilot answered him with equal gravity, "Sort of, son." "Then where's your other leg?" Thomas looked startled but recovered. "I guess I'm a cut rate Martian." Lowell seemed doubtful but did not pursue the point. The port official returned the schedule and said, "Okay, Captain, where are your outside control circuit jacks?" "Just forward of the lock. The inner terminals are here on board." "Be a few minutes." He went back outside, moving very rapidly. He was back inside in less than 10 minutes. "That's all the time it took you to mount auxiliary rockets?" Roger Stone asked incredulously. "Done it a good many times. Gets to be a routine. Besides, I've got good boys working for me." Quickly, he plugged a small portable control board to the jacks pointed out to him earlier and tested his controls. "All set." He glanced at the radar screen. "Nothing to do but loaf for a bit. You folks immigrating?" "Not exactly. It's more of a pleasure trip." "Ain't that nice? Well, it beats me what pleasure you expect to find on Mars." He glanced out the port where the reddish curve of Mars pushed up into the black. "We'll do some sightseeing, I expect. More to see in the state of Vermont than on this whole planet, I know." He looked around. "This your whole family?" "All but my wife." Roger Stone explained the situation. "Oh, yes, read about it in the Daily War Cry. They got the name of your ship wrong, though." Hazel snorted in disgust. "Newspapers." "Yes'm. I put the war god down just 4 hours ago. Berths 32 and 33. She's in quarantine, though." He pulled out a pipe. "You folks got a static precipitation?" "Yes," agreed Hazel. "Go ahead and smoke, young man." "Thanks on both counts." He made almost a career of getting it lighted. Pollux began to wonder when he intended to figure his ballistic. But Jason Thomas did not bother even to glance at the radar screen. Instead, he started a long and meandering story about his brother in law back Earthside. It seemed that this connection of his had tried to train a parrot to act as an alarm clock. The twins knew nothing of parrots and cared less. Castor began to get worried. Was this moron going to crash the stone? He began to doubt that Thomas was a pilot of any sort. The story ambled on and on. Thomas interrupted himself to say, Better hang on, everybody, and somebody ought to hold the baby. I'm not a baby, Lowell protested. I wish I was one, youngster. His hand sought his control panel as Hazel gathered Lowell in. But the joke of the whole thing was a deafening rumble shook the ship, a sound somehow more ear splitting than their own jet. It continued for seconds only. As it died, Thompson continued triumphantly, the bird never did learn to tell time. Thanks, folks. The office will bill you. He stood up with a cat-like motion, slid across the floor without lifting his feet, and said, Glad to have met you. Goodbye. They were down on Phobos. And we'll find out where they go from Phobos next time.